Well, good morning again.
Good morning.
A mother, walking past her son's room, noticed that he was on his knees, evidently in prayer. She could not help but notice, however, that he kept repeating one word over and over. Tokyo, he prayed. Tokyo, Tokyo. She wondered if this was some New Age Eastern chant he picked up from some of his friends. Later she asked him, "Oh," he said with embarrassment, "we had our geography exam today, and I was praying that God would make Tokyo the capital of France." Jesus told a parable about a widow who pestered a judge until he granted her request. Now, this was no ordinary judge. Jesus described him as one who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. In the Old West, he might have been described as a hanging judge. Men dreaded appearing in his court. Lawyers tread softly as they approached his bench. But the stern and strict judge was no match for this persistent widow. She was not a person of influence, power, or wealth, but she had a characteristic that would stand her in good stead. She would simply wear him down, and it worked. Just as surely as water continually dripping will wear down the strongest marble, her pestering prevailed. Even though he initially refused to hear her case, he finally ruled in her favor, saying to himself, "Even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will see that she gets justice, so that she won't eventually come and attack me." Persistence in prayer. That is the point of the parable. If your prayer is seemingly not answered at first, don't give up. Keep asking. That doesn't mean repeating the same chant over and over again, Tokyo, Tokyo, Tokyo. Jesus warned against vain and repetitious prayers, after all. There is a story about a little boy who was praying. "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep." And then there was a long pause. He couldn't remember what came next. His mother tried to prompt him from the doorway. "If," she said quietly. The little boy prayed. If. Then he brightened up and said triumphantly, "If he hollers, let him go, eeny, meeny, miny, mo." Persistent prayer doesn't mean empty phrases. It also doesn't mean that our prayers have to be long. There's a famous incident in the life of that great evangelist, Dwight L. Moody, with which some of us can identify. A gentleman had been called upon to pray and somehow couldn't find a quitting place. That sometimes happens in extemporaneous prayer. The fellow just went on and on and on. Now, Moody disliked long prayers in the first place, but even more importantly, he saw that this prayer was an impediment to the worship service. Finally, Moody interrupted the prayer to suggest that the congregation go ahead and sing another hymn while the dear brother finished praying. Now, in the congregation that night was a bright young medical student who had ventured into the service out of curiosity, but started to slip out during this long, boring prayer. When Moody interrupted the prayer, it struck a positive note with the young man. He sat back down and that night gave his heart to Christ. His name was William Grenfell, and he would become a medical missionary to Labrador and one of Moody's most famous converts. Martin Luther put it succinctly, "The fewer words, the better the prayer." No meaningless platitudes, no high-sounding phrases, no lengthy dissertations, but absolutely keep on praying. Even if the heavens are silent and the world is crumbling about you, and there seems to be no discernible answer, keep on praying. Even if your spouse says that you are foolish, your friends doubt your sanity, and your own faith grows thin, keep on praying. Prayer does make a difference. That's the first thing this parable says to us. Prayer changes events, and prayer changes people. It is so sad that many of us are neglecting this tremendous resource. There's a rural area of Texas that if you had visited it 50 or 60 years ago, you would have discovered grinding poverty. Today you'll find lush, green, irrigated crops, lovely, well-furnished homes, new automobiles, paved roads, well-dressed people. Inquiring about the changes, you'll be told that oil and gas have been discovered under the once barren land. During all those earlier years in poverty, the farmers had been living over untold riches, natural resources hidden beneath the ground. They simply had not discovered them, unlocked them, and used them to change the quality of their lives. Many of us live barren lives spiritually, and the sad thing is that within our reach are untold riches. In the words of a contemporary song, help is only a prayer away. Samuel Hu Muffet gives us a beautiful analogy of our condition. He tells us that when Lawrence of Arabia came to the Paris Peace Conference, he brought with him Arab chieftains who had never seen running water. They came from a land where water was scarce and greatly valued. But right there in their hotel room was a seemingly endless supply of this precious commodity available at the mere turning of a tap. When they were preparing to leave Paris, Lawrence found them trying to detach the faucet so that out in the dry desert they would always have water. Now Lawrence tried to explain to them that the water was not in the faucet, but in the huge reservoirs many miles away. They were convinced, however, that there was something magical about the faucets themselves. And so it is with many of us who get dressed up each Sunday morning, drive down to the church, maybe attend a Sunday school class or two, sing the hymns and worship, do all the good things religious people do. But meanwhile, we have cut ourselves off from the reservoir by allowing our personal prayer life to become almost non-existent. Prayer does work. Study the New Testament. See how important prayer was in the life of Jesus. See how much he talked about prayer with his disciples. See the effect of prayer on the early church. To dismiss prayer as unsophisticated, unscientific, or simply too selfish is to miss the meaning of the gospel. The very power and presence of God is available to the believer. The Word that became incarnate in Jesus Christ is still at work in the lives of persons today who are open to his leading. Prayer is the means by which we connect ourselves to the one who is the creator and sustainer of life. As Fulton Osler once said with regard to the threat of nuclear war, it would take another kind of power altogether to make an unhappy man happy, a bad man good, a cruel man kind, and a stupid man wise. Yet there is such power freely available in this world, and unless it is used, the atomic bomb, like all other useful inventions of man, will be turned to evil. Every Christian knows that redeeming power. For 2,000 years, it has been at man's disposal. Prayer does work. But a second thing needs to be said. God does not work according to our timetable, or even according to our methods in meeting his children's needs. Why should this poor widow have to plead and pester and cajole this judge to grant her wishes? Isn't this an acknowledgement that sometimes heaven is silent? Listen to Jesus' words in verse 7. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Have you ever been in a situation where you've cried day and night? Having affirmed that prayer does work, we must also add that prayer is not Aladdin's lamp. There is no magic genie who suddenly appears to satisfy our every supplication. Every saint has known that what it is to go through what is sometimes called the dark night of the soul. But why it should be so will not be known until God takes away the veil and we see him face to face. Perhaps the only acceptable answer is that we are creatures and he is creator. We are children and he is father. We are finite and he is infinite. It's a humbling thought. We are so sure that we know what's best. It's infuriating to think that God may be saying to us, even as we say to our children, not now, not today. That is not in your best interest. We do not believe that God deliberately afflicts his children, and yet it is impossible to ignore the fact that some of the world's greatest treasures were forged in the fire of adversity. If Arturo Toscanini had offered one prayer in his youth, it might have been for more perfect eyes, for he was very nearsighted. He could not foresee that at the age of 19, a remarkable event would occur that would change his life forever, thanks to his imperfect eyes. He was playing cello in an orchestra. Just before an important performance, the conductor was suddenly stricken quite ill. What would they do for someone to lead the orchestra that night? Fortunately, they discovered that one member of the orchestra had memorized the entire score. It was young Toscanini. His vision was so poor that he could not read music on a stand, and so he had trained himself to play it by heart. Who could say that Toscanini with perfect vision would have been better off? In the later years of his life, John Milton lost his position and his sight as well. His body was tortured with illness, and many of his friends forsook him. There must have been many nights and days when he cried aloud. However, it was during this time that he produced his immortal classic, Paradise Lost. Required students to read for over 300 years. John Bunyan would have prayed for deliverance from prison, but it was during that confinement that he produced Pilgrim's Progress, a work that has inspired millions. Again, we would caution that it was not God's intentional will that any of these should suffer. Still, the purpose of this world is to create souls who can glorify God and enjoy him forever. And sometimes adversity enhances this process. A popular illustration in current literature concerns Alfred Russel Wallace, a scientist of many years ago. Wallace observed a monarch butterfly trying to get out of its cocoon and wrote this about it. It struggled, pushed, and pulled for a long time until finally its body emerged fully. The butterfly rusted momentarily, fluttered its wings, and then flew away. Wallace then wondered what would happen if he helped the process. So he cut open another cocoon and waited for the butterfly to fly away. Instead, the butterfly crept moodily about, drooped imperceptibly, and died. The struggle to get out of the cocoon, Wallace discovered, was nature's way of helping the butterfly to develop. Of course, this is an impartial and imperfect explanation of delayed or unanswered prayers. Only God knows all the answers. Now we see through a glass darkly, wrote the Apostle Paul, and truly, we do. But we do know that God is a God of law. If we drive a car too fast on a curve on a mountain road and leave the road, we cannot expect a giant hand to reach out of the clouds and place our car back on the road again. So many of our problems are caused by breaking God's physical, moral, or spiritual laws. Still, this does not answer delayed response to the anguished prayer of a saint. But his ways are not our ways. Yet, prayer does work. However, God often does not heed our time schedule or use methods that we would use. And sometimes the most reasonable prayer is answered with a firm but loving no. Which brings us to the final thing to be said. In the meantime, while we're waiting for God's answer, we need to do all we can to provide our own answer. There's an old Native American proverb that says, "Call on God, but roll away from the rocks." You have to admire the widow in Jesus' parable. She didn't wait for someone else to solve her problems for her. She took responsibility for her situation and did all that she could. That's a good lesson for all of us. In Ethiopia, many years ago, there was a tremendous individual named Joe Helton who built telephone lines in some of the most remote sections of Ethiopia. These lines were strung on tall steel poles to prevent giraffes breaking the wires with their long necks, and because termites consumed wooden poles in a night. Helton contended that he owed his success to prayer. He said, "I pray, then wrestle." "Wrestle," he was asked. He answered, "Like Stanislaus Zabisco, the time he was sentenced to be shot by the Russians." Zabisco was a Polish physician who became a world champion wrestler. During World War I, he was captured by Russian soldiers and sentenced to death. Thinking to have fun with him, the Russians offered to free him if he could defeat their wrestling champion. In telling me about it, Zabisco said, "So I prayed that God would give me strength and judgment. Then I dug in and wrestled and won." Sometimes that is the answer to our prayers as well. To dig in, to pray, and then to wrestle. And when we wrestle in faith, we grow. So don't give up on your prayers. God does hear and does answer. Sometimes the answer is, be patient. Sometimes the answer is no. But always the answer will be to our best good. In the meantime, while we're waiting, let's remember that courageous lineman and that persistent widow and do all that we can to answer our own prayers. Will you please bow with me? Loving God, we pray to you in all seasons. In our seasons of rejoicing, praising you for the joys and blessings we know in our lives. In our seasons of mourning, crawling to you, begging for comfort and understanding. In our seasons of strength, seeking your wisdom to guide our energies. In our seasons of weakness, coveting your grace and acceptance. In our seasons of waiting, holding out our hands for answers and the need for patience. And in our seasons of rest, settling into true Sabbath living at a sacred place with your love enveloping us. Gracious God, be with those we hold in our hearts this day, answer their prayers, and grant them your peace as they wait. Amen.